31. 3 months later. Charlie lay still on the sleeping bag, Liz nestled in the crook of his arm, asleep. The night air had turned colder, and he was thankful for her body heat. She split her time with him in the tent and staying with Adeline at Doc's place. Staring at the tent ceiling, Charlie knew it wasn't a shelter that would be adequate come winter. And if he wanted his family to be under one roof, then they'd have to make a change. The twins had a bead on some trailers that they could haul over with the Humvee that Dixon had lent them. They'd offer a more permanent solution for their housing dilemma. "Charlie?" The voice came from outside the tent's entrance, and Charlie lifted his head, sliding out from beneath Liz, who remained asleep. He reached for the tent's flap zipper and pulled it open. A fresh breeze of crisp night air blasted him when he opened it, and found Jason crouched at eye level. "We've got something," Jason said. Charlie grabbed his boots, kissed Liz on her forehead, placed the blanket over her body, and then zipped the tent closed as he walked with Jason through their already growing field of tenants. Jason said nothing as he led Charlie toward the west guard post, passing the rows of crops that they put in the ground 2 months ago. Green had already sprouted from the ground, and Charlie found it hard to look away. The west guard post was Doc's place, and when he and Jason arrived, Shelley and Mario were on the scene. Mario was unarmed, but Shelley had a rifle aimed at the back of a man's head. "We found him in the fields trying to dig up seeds," Jason said. "He won't talk." Charlie examined the thief. "Stand him up." Shelley and Jason lifted the man to his feet and then shoved him forward so Charlie could get a better look at him. He was a wiry man, tall. His clothes were tattered, his skin tanned and weathered. He looked like a man who had spent his life outside before the world went to shit. Charlie checked the man for colors. "Are you with a clan?" The clans had grown more troublesome for Charlie and Dixon lately. They'd formed in the weeks after the EMP and become better organized, locking down territories in the different suburbs outside of Seattle. So far, none of them had been tempted to come this far east, but Charlie knew that wouldn't last forever. Squabbling over food, water, shelter, and medicine grew more intense every day. Anyone who had supplies was either absorbed into a clan, or they were killed, and the clans took their supplies. Most people chose to join, if nothing more than the fact that there was safety in numbers. And while most of the clans were relatively small in nature, Charlie had noticed one clan growing at an exponential rate. They identified themselves with an article of blue on their arm, was usually a bandana or a piece of cloth. Charlie and his folks had already experienced a few dust-ups with that clan, and out of all the people to fight, he feared them the most. Not because of their numbers, but because of their organization, their structure. It was like watching the rise of a tyrant. But Charlie suspected that's exactly what others thought of him and Dixon. People with resources trying to expand, trying to rebuild, gathering as many people and supplies as they could. It was as though everyone was preparing for a fight. No one knew when it would happen, but they felt it coming. It was as real as the hunger in their bellies. "Did he have a weapon on him?" Charlie asked. Shelley nodded and handed over a 9mm Ruger handgun. Charlie ejected the magazine and found it fully loaded, then shoved it back into the weapon. "Haven't used this today," Charlie said. "But what about yesterday?" "You're asking me if I killed anyone?" The man kept his head down while he spoke. It was the first response that anyone had been able to get out of him. He raised his head. "Have you killed people, Charlie?" "You know who I am," Charlie said, then stepped forward, bringing him a breath away from the thief. "Then you know that around here stealing is a crime, and that crime is punishable by death. Haven't you stolen food? Haven't you done things to survive that were criminal?" Charlie ignored the question. "Are you with a clan?" "Yes." "Which one?" The thief smiled. "Afraid you might kill a member of the wrong one? I just need to know what kind of pushback I might be dealing with." "So you're worried that I'm with the Blue Boys?" The thief nodded, rocking back on his heels. "They're making quite the name for themselves. They have a few rules, like the ones you're talking about, too." He shook his head. "I'm not with a clan." The way the thief spoke, Charlie couldn't be sure if the man was playing games with him. If he was, then his people would undoubtedly come looking for him after he was gone, and the orchard would be the first logical place to check. "Take him to the fields," Charlie said. Shelley shoved the thief hard into the back and forced the man forward, everyone following, with Charlie bringing up the rear. They dragged the thief out into the orchard, far enough away from where Charlie couldn't see the house or the barn. All that surrounded them was blackened ash and death. Shelley turned the thief around to face Charlie, and Charlie noticed that the man's eye had reddened during the walk. "So you're the judge, jury, and executioner, huh?" He laughed, then wiped his nose. "Why don't you let me join your crew?" "Hiring a thief is like inviting rot in the garden," Charlie said, and then held out his hand. Shelley placed the rifle in it. "You don't notice it at first, but it spreads. It comes at the plant from inside out. It's not until the plants are dead that you realize what's happened." He loaded a bullet into the chamber, then aimed the rifle at the thief's head. "I just wanted to eat," the thief said. "I won't come back," the thief answered. "You'll never see me again, I promise." Charlie adjusted his finger over the trigger. People don't keep promises anymore. "Boss?" Mario took a step forward, then stopped when Charlie cut him a glare. He held his hands up, then retreated. "Is there no mercy left in you?" The thief frowned, his mouth trembling. Charlie examined the man in front of him, a man who only wanted food that had been so readily available for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to be hungry. Hunger was an ache that carved you hollow, all the way down to your bones. It was a hunger that had spread, and Charlie knew that until he could get a fresh round of crops into the ground and get a harvest before winter, those seeds were the only thing keeping his people from going 6 feet under. Charlie placed the end of the rifle barrel against the thief's temple. "Not anymore." The thief's scream was cut short by the thunder of the gunshot, the flash of the light from the muzzle brightening the carnage that ejected from the back of the thief's skull. And while Mario winced from the gunshot and turned away from the blood, brain, and bone that was splattered across the dirt, Charlie didn't divert his gaze. He remembered his father telling him that the first time he ever went hunting, you stared down your prey, all the way till the end, because when you killed something, you owned it. But while this wasn't hunting, Charlie knew the same principles still applied. There was no going back. It was a line that once you crossed, you could never step back on the other side. Charlie had murdered a man, willingly and deliberately, and he knew that he'd have to kill more before all of this was finished. 32. 1 year later. The sky was colored in the light blues and grays of early morning. In a few minutes, when the first rays of dawn peeked over the horizon in the east, it would gleam off the roofs of the RVs that filled the once empty acreage of Doc's property. The mobile homes hadn't moved since their arrival. They'd trickled in over the past year, 1, then 2, then dozens at a time. They'd all heard the rumors of a haven with food, water, and the promise of protection. And when they arrived at the stretch of land, they had all come to speak with the one man that had laid the foundation for such a place to exist. Charlie Decker stood on the steps outside of the silver streamlined trailer, parked at the very front of the property. He looked east, enjoying the quiet of the morning before the village around him woke. A thick beard concealed his face, and his hair was slicked back, nearly long enough to touch his shoulders. The wrinkles around his eyes had multiplied, the creases growing more worn from the sleepless nights that continued to plague him. He had hoped that time would ease the restlessness, but as the days grew longer, then shorter, and then colder, then longer and warm again, Charlie found no such peace. No matter how secure the orchard became, or how much food they had, or how many guns or supplies they stored, his restlessness plagued him like a nagging tick. A pair of guards on patrol passed Charlie. "Boss," the pair said. Charlie nodded curtly and remained on the steps until they walked out of sight. He stepped back inside, doing his best to remain quiet, but the streamliner's age made it more prone to agitation. Charlie couldn't prevent his footsteps from breaking the silence, but she was already awake. Liz stood over the gas stove, boiling water and reaching for the coffee grounds in the small pantry next to their kitchenette. She turned to him, smiling. "Good morning." She kept her voice quiet, and then gestured to the tiny cubby where Adeline slept. She's still passed out. Charlie smiled at the little girl curled up beneath her covers. He walked over and kissed the top of her head. "Need a bigger trailer soon," Liz said. "She's growing like a weed." Charlie nodded, then walked up behind her, sliding his hands around her waist. He nuzzled her neck, and she playfully shied away from him. He kissed her cheek and then walked to the trailer's rear, reaching into the closet of the bedroom and removing the Kevlar vest from inside. Divots from bullet holes and knife blades riddled both sides of the vest. He strapped it on, and when he turned back to Liz, she was no longer smiling. "I didn't know there was a raid today," Liz said. "Dixon gave us some intelligence of a cell nearby," Charlie said. "It's inside our boundaries, so we're handling it." Liz nodded. "Are you taking the twins?" "Yep." "Good." The twins had become an integral part of Charlie's raiding crew. They'd proven their worth time and time again as effective soldiers, though neither of them had any formal training. They were another layer to the bulletproof vest that he took with him. It helped both him and Liz breathe easier. The past year had seen several people come to join Charlie's growing township, especially after the emergency shelter in Seattle went under. With the swell of people spreading out from the city, Charlie and Dixon helped as many as they could. And while Charlie and Dixon had helped one another handle the influx of survivors, Charlie wouldn't have called their relationship a friendship, but more of a mutually assured business venture. Dixon needed food and Charlie needed guns and ammunition. Plus, more supply shipments were coming from the east, and a trade bartering system had grown commonplace between Mayfield and the orchard. "If everything goes according to plan, then I should be back by this afternoon," Charlie said, trying to wrap his arms around Liz once more, but she resisted, stepping away from him and toward the cabinet that held the mugs. "Dixon has an entire base of soldiers," Liz said. "He should take care of those matters." She turned to him. "You're needed here." "I'm needed wherever there is a threat to our home," Charlie replied, keeping his tone even-keeled and not wanting to spark a fight. "And if we don't take a stand against—" "Okay." Liz held up her hands, then placed some of the coffee grounds in the strainer before she poured boiling water over it. She handed the finished product to Charlie. "Thank you." Charlie leaned in for a kiss, and this time was granted landing. His hands found the scar on her stomach, and he caressed it gently. "Try not to come home with a souvenir, all right?" Liz asked. "I won't." He kissed her harder, and then was out the door and weaving through the field of mobile homes, trailers, and RVs, on his way toward Doc's place. A few doors opened along the way, the residents inside offering a friendly wave or smile to Charlie as he sipped the coffee. With the number of housing units crammed into the tight space, Charlie would have thought that people would have gone stir-crazy from being in such close quarters, Charlie included. After a lifetime of growing up on an orchard with open space and places to roam, he thought living in a tin can would be a difficult adjustment. But it wasn't. The only real time he spent in the trailer was when he slept. But a pleasant side effect of the close quarters was the fact that he knew everyone who lived with them. He knew where they had come from, what had pushed them from their homes, their skills, their fears, and what they hoped to do when the power finally came back on. These were Charlie's people, like Adeline. They were an extended family he never intended to adopt, but one he inherited nonetheless. Up ahead, Charlie spotted Mario coming out of his trailer, giving Maria a kiss, who saw Charlie before Mario did. "Buenos dias, Charlie," she shouted, no doubt waking up some of the neighbors. Mario turned and offered a friendly wave. "Hey, boss." Charlie nodded. "How's the new crop taking?" "It's too soon to tell," Mario answered, "but I'll be checking on it again today. We have a short window to make sure it takes, or else the trees won't be mature enough to survive the winter," Charlie said, turning back toward Mario after he passed him. "Let's make that a priority." Mario gave a thumbs up and headed toward the west fields, where he'd meet up with the field hands. Charlie had christened Mario as head farmer, and the man had taken to it as well as Charlie had suspected. Mario never had the stomach for raids, and Charlie was glad to have someone he trusted work the land. Charlie rarely walked the fields anymore. It made him uneasy, made him remember. Nostalgia was dangerous. Spending too much time living in the past affected the future, so he kept the past buried. The crew were already at the shack, which was what everyone lovingly referred to as Doc's place. The nickname for the house came after the Frankenstein patch job Doc and the others had done on the place. The old man had refused to move into one of the trailers, stating that he wanted to live in a tin can, then he would have retired in Florida. "Doc up?" Charlie asked. "He's making breakfast," Shelley answered, cleaning her gun. "If you want something other than burnt eggs and bacon, then you better talk him out of it." "How that old fart burns eggs, I'll never understand," Jason replied, counting the bullets in his magazine. "I mean, you actually have to try and burn eggs." The twins were always the first up when it was time for the raid. In fact, Charlie didn't think they slept at all. It was unsettling. Shelley reassembled her weapon deftly, then rested the assault rifle along her lap and stared at Charlie. "You know what we're hitting today?" "Yeah," Charlie answered, then sipped his coffee. "How many?" Jason asked, retaining his leisurely post after he finished his bullet count. "Dixon's intelligence says 9. "Who else is coming?" Shelley asked. "Nick and Lee." Shelley rolled her eyes and Jason smirked. "That gonna be a problem?" Charlie asked, looking at Shelley. "Not unless Nick makes it one," Shelley answered, her tone already riddled with stress. But then caught Charlie's lingering eye and changed her tune. "It'll be fine." "Yeah," Jason said, laughing. "What could go wrong between two ex-lovers with automatic weapons?" Shelley flipped the bird to her brother. Charlie headed inside, drawn in by the scent of sizzling bacon. Doc was hunched over the gas grill that he'd transported into the kitchen next to a window, where the smoke funneled outside through a homemade chute he'd compiled out of portions of the air conditioning ducts that he'd salvaged from his own house. "Breakfast is almost done," Doc replied. "You can tell those mongrels outside that they need to stop showing up so early and make breakfast the same damn time every damn day." "I'll let them know," Charlie said. The twins were frequent house guests of Doc, and aside from Charlie and a few others, they were the only folks he talked to. It had been that way ever since his wife passed. She had suffered a stroke during the winter, in the middle of the night, and while his wife didn't suffer, the callus that formed over Doc's soul was only penetrable by a few. Charlie didn't know why or how the twins had carved out a spot in Doc's circle of trust, but he suspected it was because the twins didn't know him before his wife had passed. He thought that maybe Doc liked being able to speak to people as he was now without them having the expectation that he was supposed to be something else. Charlie understood that. "Another raid?" Doc asked, his attention still focused on the bacon and eggs, which Charlie noticed were just beginning to burn. "Yeah," Charlie answered. "Good." Doc flipped over the bacon, the grease sizzling and popping in the pan, his mouth downturned in a grimace. "You'll have the room ready in case we need it?" Charlie asked. Doc grunted and nodded. The room was what Charlie and his security detail called the operating table. While Doc had the supplies and tools needed to perform surgeries, it was hard to find a sanitary space, so the RV that Charlie had brought back for Doc to use had become that space. It was always ready to go per the orchard's protocol, but Charlie still liked to ask, because while Doc hadn't lost any skill from his job, he had grown forgetful. Doc piled the burnt eggs and bacon onto a plate and then handed it to Charlie. "Don't get shot out there," he said, then disappeared back into the shambled wreckage of his home. The home he refused to leave after it had burned down. Charlie headed back outside, Nick and Lee accounted for and ready to go. He looked for any sign of tension between Shelley and Nick, but other than a casual indifference, there was nothing else. He wished the pair had just kept it in their pants, but it wasn't his decision to make. "We need to get moving, so I hope everyone can eat and listen at the same time," Charlie said, taking a scoop of eggs that he shoveled into his mouth before passing the plate around. Dixon gave me intel on a local cell within our patrol radius, no more than 9. Dixon's scouts didn't spy any heavy artillery. Commander Dixon and his men have been intercepting refueling supplies that they believed were intended for the local cell, which means they're running low on ammunition. Nothing as dangerous as a hungry animal, Lee said, shoveling a bite of blackened eggs into his mouth, which was about all that was left on the plate since he was the last to eat. They have guards on watch on the north and south sides of their house, which happens to be close to the clans, so we'll want to eliminate those targets quietly. We leave in 10. 33. Charlie rode shotgun in the rusted Humvee. Dixon had let them borrow one of their military vehicles once they started performing raids. It was all part of the symbiotic relationship that they'd formed over the past year. Both men knew they couldn't have made any progress without the other, and while they may have butted heads over a few items over the past year, they both had the same goal when it came to the terrorists: wipe them out. Even without the use of modern technology and communication, Dixon and the rest of the military were still effective in their second round of assaults after the EMP strike. The recovery time of their country's military was surprisingly quick. But even with their agility and adaptability, neither Dixon nor Charlie could have imagined the conflict against the Korean forces to last this long. However, part of their enemy's plan was to recruit and manipulate members of the local population. Once food and water grew scarce, anyone who was able to provide those life-sustaining needs found themselves in a position of power. And it was a power that not everyone wielded with the same responsibility as Charlie and Dixon. "Heads up," Jason said. "We're near clan territory now." Everyone kept their eyes peeled on the run-down houses that they passed on either side of the road. Windows had been boarded up, and the vegetation in the yards had grown to provide more cover for anyone looking to ambush, so it made any trip toward the edge of their safe zone more dangerous. "Just keep moving," Charlie said. "The sooner we get to our stationary position, the sooner we can set up a perimeter." "No complaints about that from me, boss," Jason said. "You'd think that those fuckers would have the good sense to just join the rest of us in trying to rebuild society instead of clinging to the shitholes they've buried themselves inside," Nick said. Shelley chuckled. "They don't have anyone to answer to, no one to tell them how to live their lives." She gestured to the crumbling houses and neighborhoods that started to pop up more frequently the further they drove. "This is their world now, and you'd be crazy if you think that they'd just give up their freedom for chains again." "Freedom?" Nick laughed, then poked his thumb at a few of the houses that they passed. "Are you serious? That's not what these people have." "We're not here to start a philosophy class," Charlie said, cutting into the conversation before it became too heated. Nick shifted in his seat. "I never liked school anyway." Despite the heightened sense of awareness that accompanied a trip near the clan's territory, the unit arrived at their location without incident. Charlie stepped out of the Humvee, the rest of his unit moving silently and efficiently behind him as he took point. The house that was their target sat 100 yards to the west. Charlie raised his scope to get a better look at the situation and found one stationary guard on the back side of the house. Jason crouched near Charlie and then lowered his scope. "South side in the trees." He looked to the twin. "You think you can make the shot?" Jason raised his rifle, which he had personally modified. He found the guard in the branches and then lowered it. "He has a lot of cover, but I should be able to get him." "Wait for the signal," Charlie said, then spun around and found the rest of his crew ready to go. 4-man standard. I want targets down in one shot. Let's make this quick and clean." Nods reciprocated the orders, and Charlie turned and led his men through the overgrown jungle of the former neighborhood, turned war zone. Charlie weaved around the yards, staying low through the tall grass. The number of missions that Charlie had gone on over the past year had honed his senses. Whenever he was on a raid, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was no orchard back home. There was no Liz, no Adeline, no friends, no family, no other responsibility. The only thing that mattered was the rifle in his hands and the men and women at his back. Charlie had discovered that there was no greater equalizer than the battlefield. Race, gender, religion. Each of them were pointless. War only cared for the offering of blood you brought to the altar of battle. With less than 30 yards before the house appeared at the end of the street, Charlie held up his hand, the unit stopping in unison from the wordless order. He raised the scope of his rifle and waited until he had a shot lined up against the side of the watchman's head. Then, keeping his aim steady, he flicked on the laser marker that highlighted the side of the guard's face. The green beam was colorless unless you were either looking through Charlie's scope or through Jason's scope, stationed 100 yards away in the tall grass. But their target, the man in the tree, had no idea he was being stalked, up until the millisecond of consciousness that remained to him, when the bullet from Jason's sniper rifle sailed silently into his skull and his body slumped lifelessly in the tree branches. With the guard taken out, Charlie and the others stormed forward toward the house. The group was so well seasoned that there was hardly anything that surprised them during a raid, and despite the terrorists' initial resourcefulness of sneaking into the country and disrupting their power grid, Charlie quickly learned that the remaining cluster of cells were highly predictable, which only made them easier to kill. Charlie paused at the back door and then sent Shelley and Nick around toward the front. Once Nick and Shelley rounded the corner, Charlie counted to 10, and then he tapped the top of his fist against his helmet so Lee knew what was coming next. Because the moment that Charlie flung that door inward and breached the house, they became an avalanche. Whatever was in their path, whatever they came across, was swallowed up and buried with an unforgiving and unrelenting force. And Charlie wasn't done until everyone inside was dead. Charlie reached 10 and kicked the door open. The element of surprise vanished. With the windows boarded up, Charlie stepped into the pitch black. The darkness was suddenly interrupted by the flash of muzzle barrels from the surprised enemies sitting around the kitchen table. Charlie's heart rate skyrocketed, and the adrenaline elevated his senses. He pivoted left, his heel grinding against the gritty surface of the dirty kitchen floor. A darkened figure appeared in his scope, the body silhouetted against the backdrop of the wall. One squeeze of Charlie's trigger finger and the familiar recoil of the rifle stock smacked against his shoulder. The darkened figure's arms flailed comically to their sides. Another gunshot pulled Charlie's attention to the right, and through the edge of his peripheral vision he saw a body hit the floor. A muzzle flash around the corner pulled Charlie toward the hallway that led him out of the kitchen and deeper into the house. After 5 steps into the darkness, Charlie's vision started to adjust. And when he turned the corner, he fired at the man sprinting down the hall and dropped him before he turned the corner. Charlie paused in the hallway as he waited for Lee to join him. "Go in the kitchen," Lee said. Charlie added the one in the hallway to the tally. 3, 3, 3. Charlie and Lee held their position in the hallway waiting for Nick up front. They repeated the number of killed targets 3 times so they could keep track of how many they had left. 4, 4, 4, Nick shouted from the front of the house. In the same instant, Charlie and Lee dropped to their knees, rifles raised and primed to shoot. And then a dark figure darted from the end of the hall. Charlie and Lee squeezed the trigger. 1, 1, 1, Charlie shouted. Once the second gunman that Nick had alerted them to vanished. Only one to go. Charlie and Lee held their position for 3 seconds, waiting to see if a second gunman was hesitating and would charge around the corner. But they never appeared. When the moment passed, Charlie pushed himself off his knee, his joints cracking from the momentary pause, and then rushed down the hallway, Lee right behind him. He paused at the corner, ignoring the corpse at his feet. "Fuck," Lee whispered. "I think they're down." Charlie shook his head. Negative. No movement, no gunshots, no sound, save for the breaths passed between Charlie and Lee as they waited anxiously for the final call-out. A minute passed, then 2. The seconds drew out into painfully slow motion. Finally, Charlie pounded his fist against his head and then turned the corner. If the last remaining terrorist was playing the waiting game, then they'd be here all night, and Charlie didn't have any plans on having a sleepover. He turned the corner, which revealed another hallway, with 2 doors on the left and 1 door on the right. All of them were closed. Charlie headed toward the first door, unsure if the remaining shooter was inside, but knowing that he couldn't pass without clearing them first. He positioned himself near the first door and waited for Lee to slide into position next to him, his rifle trained on the door crack. Charlie reached for the door and counted down by mouthing the numbers. 3, 2, 1. Charlie pushed the door inward, and Lee rushed inside, Charlie following quickly behind him as they cleared opposite sides of the room. Both pounded their fists onto their helmets to signal that the room was clear and then returned toward the hallway. The next door was the one on the right, and again Charlie and Lee repeated the same fluid motion that they had in the first room. And while they didn't find the enemies inside, Charlie paused before he stepped back out into the hallway, his eyes fixated on the desks that lined the walls. It was hard to make out the objects that lined the desks in the darkness, but from what he could tell, they were workstations. But with Lee already at the door again, Charlie didn't linger in the room, returning to the hallway, turning their focus to the last door on the left. Again, Charlie and Lee assumed the same positions. Charlie mouthed the countdown. 3, 2, 1. He swung the door inward, and the moment Lee was exposed from the crack in the door, the hallway exploded with gunfire. In Charlie's peripheral, he watched Lee fall, and then he pushed forward into the room, ears ringing from the gunshots. Charlie scanned the corner of the room where the shots had come from and squeezed the trigger. 4 seconds of gunfire ended, and Charlie turned his rifle away from the last terrorist on the ground, his instinct and year-long training propelling him to finish the scan of the room, then lowered his weapon after he mentally counted the magic number of 9 dead inside the house. "Clear! Clear! Clear!" Charlie shouted, his voice hoarse from the sudden volume increase. He spun around in the same instant and dropped to a knee to examine Lee. "Where'd it hit?" Lee rolled back and forth, grimacing in pain and clutching his stomach. "The vest, but I don't know if it went through. Motherfucker, that hurts." He kicked the door frame with his heel, rattling through the rest of the house, and Nick and Shelley rounded the corner of the hallway. Shit. Shelley joined Lee's side and helped Charlie remove the vest. "If Dixon would give us some new fucking gear, then we wouldn't have this problem," Nick said, spewing his frustration from behind them. "What the hell happened up front?" Charlie asked. "The living room fed into a dining room with a lot of open space," Shelley said. "They must have already been in the middle of the house by the time we busted through the front door and started shooting, so it gave them time to retreat towards you." The Kevlar peeled off, and Charlie lifted Lee's shirt. Lee remained flat on his back, lifting his head up like a turtle, trying to see his stomach. "Is it bad?" Lee asked, his voice cracking from the nerves. Charlie exhaled. "It didn't go through." Shelley laughed and then smacked Lee's exposed and pale belly, which elicited a harsh smack. "Ow!" Lee grimaced, but started laughing. But while the group relaxed, their objective complete and the targets wiped out, Charlie stood and returned to the hallway. He reached for the light on his belt and then flashed it inside the middle room he passed, scanning the workbenches that lined the walls. Charlie took a closer look at the poorly shaped bricks on the table. "Hey, I need Jason in here now." Nick poked his head inside the room and let out a low whistle. Charlie spun around, holding up the plastic explosive. "C4. He gestured to the other tables. "They must have close to 100 pounds in this place." Shelley came in next, followed by a hunched-over Lee holding his Kevlar jacket. "Detonators, timing devices." Shelley picked up a few of the parts and examined the exposed copper wires and cooking timers. "Christ, they've got enough C4 in here to blow up Seattle." Charlie flashed his lights toward the middle table, where a stack of papers had been hastily scattered. He approached, plucking one off the top of the stack. "It's in Korean." But littered among the foreign jargon, Charlie saw the sketches of blueprints. A pair of boots jogged down the hallway, and then Jason entered. "Looks like our friends have been busy," Jason said, walking over to his sister and plucking a timer from her hands. "Have you seen anything like this?" Charlie asked, holding up the paper in his hand. Jason scanned it quickly. "Demolition plans." He set the paper down and then moved toward another pile of pages, picking them up one by one, scanning them just as fast. Christ, this is for one big building. Charlie stepped closer toward Jason. Does it give a location? Jason studied the papers faster, then shook his head. Not specifically. It's either one place or several targets. He shook his head, no longer reading the pages and just picking them up and trying to put them in order. Some information is missing. Let's pat down the bodies and see if any of them tried to run out with the rest of the plans, Charlie said. And on his order, everyone but Jason left the room. He inched closer to Jason, then lowered his voice. You think this could be for the power plant? Jason took a moment to look over the plans. That would make sense, but until I have all the pieces, it's hard to say for sure. Right. Charlie tried not to jump to any conclusions, but with this cell's proximity to the orchard in Mayfield, it was hard not to draw the connection. And there was no telling how many more of the cells out there had similar plans. If they were lucky, this was it. But Charlie hadn't been lucky in a long time, and he didn't think that was going to change anytime soon. 34. Nick took over as wheelman when they got back to the Humvee, while Lee nursed his tender stomach in the back seat, enjoying the attention from Shelley, who doubled as their medic in the field. I suppose I should be glad your brother isn't the one taking care of me, Lee said, smiling, giving her a playful wink. Shelley placed her palm over his wound, the touch tender at first, and then pressed hard, causing Lee to buckle forward and howl and squirm in his seat. Careful what you wish for, Shelley said. Jason laughed and then gently caressed Lee's cheek. I'm the one with the gentle touch, Lee. Lee jerked his face away from Jason's hand, and Jason laughed again as Lee wiggled uncomfortably between the twins. Both of you are nuts, Lee said. Charlie turned around, looking at Jason. You decipher anything else from those papers? Jason cocked an eyebrow up and shuffled through the papers again, the motion ceremonial. Negative. It has to be the power plant, though, right? Nick asked, one hand on the wheel, driving the Humvee like it was a Z-28 Camaro. It makes sense, Shelley added. Dixon's almost done with reconstruction. But doubt swirled around Charlie's head. Maybe. He tapped his finger along the side of the door, the glass against his arm rattling from the rough ride. He flicked his eyes at the rearview mirror and the pile of explosives in back. What are you thinking, boss? Lee asked. Charlie chewed it over. We need to go to Mayfield. Nick sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. You think there are more bombs than what we found? Shelley asked. I'm thinking we don't have the whole picture, Charlie answered. And I want to know if Dixon has been keeping information to himself. The rest of the trip to Mayfield was in silence, save for the occasional grunt from Lee as he adjusted himself between the twins. Jason suggested that Lee go lay down on the plastic explosive, told him that they could make a nice bed. Lee flipped Jason the bird. The road from the orchard and into Mayfield had been cleared. A few other main roadways into Seattle had been cleared as well, which acted as the main supply routes between Dixon's unit and the other military posts that had been established to help sniff out the remaining terrorist threat and aid in the rebuilding efforts. But seeing as how Dixon's unit was in control of one of the region's most critical support centers, the former lieutenant carried a lot of weight and was privy to information that most weren't. Dixon usually shared that information, which helped Charlie prepare for any shortages or conflicts that were headed his way. And if Dixon knew something about this type of wide-scale bombing, Charlie was going to have a few words about what they had just walked into. And if he didn't know, well, then Dixon and his people were sleeping on the job. The first barricade they approached was a simple 2-man post with barbed wire and sandbags stacked on either side of the road. Nick didn't bother stopping, seeing as how all of Dixon's guards knew Charlie and his unit. Their group had earned respect from the soldiers under Dixon, who lovingly referred to Charlie and his crew as the Mercs. The nickname was short for mercenaries. Charlie and his unit were the only non-military combat crew that Dixon allowed on base. The second barricade, which was positioned just before Mayfield's main street in the town itself, required a stop for everyone. It was protocol, even for Dixon. The president himself wouldn't be able to get through without a badge. Charlie fished his identification out of his pocket, which was a local sheriff's badge that Dixon and Charlie had found. Since there was a limited number of badges and it was the only sheriff's station in the county, Dixon and Charlie figured they'd be good to dole out for security purposes. "Hey, Charlie." The guard at the post took Charlie's badge with a smile, giving it the ceremonial once-over before handing it back to him. "What brings you to Mayfield?" "Need to talk to Commander Dixon," Charlie said, adding Dixon's title. He made sure to do that whenever he was speaking to one of Dixon's subordinates, another part of their deal. The old lieutenant had grown accustomed to being in charge. "You have an appointment with him?" the guard asked. Charlie gestured toward the back of the Humvee. "Got a present for him." The guard narrowed his eyes suspiciously at Charlie, and then motioned for the second guard to investigate. "Holy shit, Sarge!" The guard stuck his head from out the back. "They got enough C4 to blow us all to Kingdom Come." Sergeant Scarborough briskly headed toward the Humvee's rear, and Charlie watched the man's face light up in surprise, as if his soldier had lied to him. "Christ, Charlie," Scarborough said. "Is it stable?" Charlie looked to Jason. "Yes," Jason answered. "Just don't touch it." Scarborough retracted a finger and then placed his hands on his hips. "Let them through and radio Commander Dixon that he has company." The gate went up, and Charlie waved goodbye to the gate guards. Over the past year, Mayfield had been transformed from a sleepy little northwestern town into a fully operational military installation. Most of the buildings that could be repaired after the fires last year were patched up, but the first several dozen houses and businesses that Charlie saw outside his window would most likely never be rebuilt again. Charlie had asked Dixon one time why he didn't have his men clear the rubble at the front of the town once he started to get more manpower, and Dixon simply told him that it was because he didn't want his men to forget what the enemy could do. Soldiers traversed the sidewalks, another transformation of the little town. Gone were the days of tourists visiting from different parts of the country, and Charlie never thought he'd miss them as much as he did now. The farther they traveled into town, the more militarized it became, and just before they reached Dixon's office, which used to be the town's old hardware store, Charlie saw the hospital and then the power plant in the distance. It was where Dixon had the highest levels of security. Soldiers and watchmen were crawling over every square inch of space. Guard towers had been erected at the plant's four corners and were manned 24 hours. Nick parked in front of the commander's building, and Charlie stepped out of the Humvee just as Commander Dixon exited the building, flanked by his staff. "Charlie," Dixon said, no hint of joy or excitement in his voice at the sight of his old friend. "I was told you had a surprise for me." He shook Charlie's hand. "I wasn't told if it was good or bad." "I'm not sure which one it is yet either." Dixon grunted and then rubbed his freshly shaven face. While Charlie had grown his beard and shaggy hair, Dixon maintained his grooming habits. Charlie opened the back of the Humvee and watched Dixon's face as the commander eyed the stacks of C4 bricks. "You found these at the cell you raided?" Dixon asked, focused on the enormous amounts of bricks. "And these?" Charlie handed over the blueprints, and the lines of concern that covered Dixon's face deepened as he examined them closely. Dixon shuffled through the papers, shaking his head. "Where is this?" "I was hoping you could tell me," Charlie answered. Dixon handed the papers to one of the men next to him, then ran his palms over his freshly buzzed head. He faced Charlie. "Let's take a walk." The pair of men headed toward the power plant, but they walked alone. Dixon was quiet for a while and waited until they were out of earshot of anyone nearby. "We're less than 3 weeks away from having the power plant operational," Dixon said, ending the silence. "I thought it was at least 3 months," Charlie said. "That's what I've told people, and that's what I want them to believe." Dixon kept his hands pinned behind his back, his posture rigid and unyielding even in motion. "Over the past year, we've wiped out more terrorist cells than I can count. The total kill number is sitting somewhere in the thousands." He stopped dead in his tracks, gazing out at the power plant in the distance, the shouts of the men on patrol drifting toward them. "And yet we still find more of them every week. It's like there's a leak in the boat and we just can't fucking plug it." Charlie stepped around and blocked Dixon's view of the power plant. "What do you know that you're not telling me?" Dixon hesitated, but finally nodded as though he concluded the argument in his head. "Intelligence coming in from Seattle is telling us that the remaining terrorist threat in our region is scaling up for an attack. We intercepted a few messages between some of the smaller parties, but we don't know when or where. Our best guess was they are going to hit the power plant, but the truth is we don't know." "And you think the C4 we found is part of that?" Charlie asked. "I don't know." Dixon shook his head, those worry lines on his face growing deeper and aging the young man right before Charlie's eyes. It was the smallest details that gave the former lieutenant away. The dark circles under his eyes, the drooped shoulders, the strands of gray that had appeared prematurely. Charlie was sure that he'd aged over the past year. But it had been a while since he'd checked himself in a mirror. In fact, he avoided them as much as possible. If the terrorists are gearing up for something, then we have to assume there are another dozen places like the one we just raided. And better guarded, Charlie said. "I doubt that we just happened to stumble on the only cell manufacturing explosives. That stuff was homemade, which means that their recipe has more than likely been passed around." He stepped closer to Dixon. "Are you sure you're telling me everything that you know?" Dixon's expression went from friend to commander in less than a second. "We have an agreement, Charlie, but I'm not obliged to pass along every piece of intelligence that I receive back to you. Our relationship has worked best by the pair of us staying in our lanes, so why don't we stick to that?" "And you're sure that there isn't anything else I need to know?" Charlie asked, still pressing the issue. Dixon remained stoic, but Charlie noticed the struggle just below the surface. Finally, the commander relented. "The orchard might be a target," Dixon said. "What?" Charlie had expected a surprise, but this had come out of left field. "That is the only other large structural resource in the area," Dixon replied. "You and your team have developed a reputation, and it's no secret that you supply half the food for our military efforts." "How long have you known?" Charlie asked. "That's none of your concern. It is if it means that my people have been open to a full-blown assault, and you haven't told me about it." Charlie's cheeks reddened from the sudden burst of anger. His outburst was caught by a few nearby soldiers on their walk from the power plant. Dixon leaned into Charlie's assault, the commander refusing to back down. "I didn't get the intel until yesterday, and it was only hearsay. We had zero credibility to believe it was true, and the schematics that you found prove that. Those weren't drawn up to attack the orchard. Those were buildings." He gestured toward the power plant. "Probably that one." "What's the timeline?" Charlie asked. "A week, maybe 2. Dixon shrugged. "The brass in Seattle and Washington are hoping it's a month, because then we'll have the power up. The sooner we can get things back to normal, the easier it'll be for us to stomp out the insects. We shine a light on them, they scatter, but much of the country is still in the dark. We're the closest operation to completion, so brass wants to use us as a testing ground." "I need more men for security," Charlie said. "Can't do that," Dixon said. "If the terrorists really want to disrupt operations out here, you don't think they've considered hitting the food supply? They've done it before. If we get the power back on, then it won't matter if the food supply gets hit, because then we'll have transportation, refrigeration, communications, all of it back online." Dixon pointed east. "Washington has truckloads of provisions just waiting to get to us. But until we have the power back on and refrigeration to store them, then they stay east of the Mississippi. Not to mention the medicines that are needed over here." "So once the power comes back on, you think you don't need us?" Charlie asked. "You think that everything will just go back to the way things were?" Charlie snapped his fingers. "Just like that. I'm just telling you what my orders are. And I need every man here to help defend this place if we're under attack. The only way the enemy gets through our defenses is if there's a crack, and I'm not going to willingly create one by giving you some of our men." He sighed, his voice softening. "I'm sorry, but the answer is no." Charlie laughed, then nodded. "Well, don't blow yourself up with all that C4, all right?" Charlie turned to leave, but Dixon called after him. "Charlie!" Charlie turned. "I was planning to come tomorrow so long as that's all right with you." Charlie exhaled and then nodded. See you then. 35. The ride back to the orchard was quiet. The twins were upset that the C4 was taken, the pair having a few choice words for the soldiers who unloaded it from the Humvee. Lee was still wallowing in agony over his bruised abdomen, and Nick's contribution on the ride back were the heavy grunts and sighs as he shifted positions in the driver's seat, unable to get comfortable. Charlie stared out the window on the drive back, his mind racing over the different security nightmares that he'd have to deal with, struggling to come up with the resources needed to ensure the safety of his people. Anytime resources were spread thin, it always made it easier for items to fall through the cracks, and that was something Charlie desperately wanted to avoid. The sight of the orchard ahead helped ease some of the concerns, aided by the sensation of returning home, which had a new meaning for him. He suspected it had a new meaning for everyone. It was late afternoon when they returned, and everyone was on the back end of their workday. Charlie watched field hands work the crops along the Bigelow property, and then saw the cleanup crews still clearing parts of the Decker orchard. Most of the trees had been removed, leaving only a few skeletons from the past. Nick parked the Humvee in front of Doc's house, and one of the guards on duty was already heading over with a fresh can of fuel to replenish what they'd spent on their journey. It was protocol. Charlie wanted every vehicle they had to be ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. It was a worst-case scenario, but he wasn't going to get caught with his pants down again. Lee waddled into Doc's house in search of some pain relief for his bruises. The twins departed without a word, stomping off and still upset over the loss of the explosives. You good, boss? Nick asked. Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. Nick pounded his fist twice on the Humvee hood, and then headed toward his trailer. Charlie lingered by the Humvee for a moment, calculating all the possible scenarios the enemy could do to take them out. But apart from driving cars lined with explosives straight into the homes and fields that comprised Charlie's growing village, he arrived at the conclusion that unless the enemy had drastically replenished their ranks, they didn't have the numbers to take them in an all-out assault. They were too well defended and too well armed. Heard you found some bad shit. Charlie turned around and saw Doc standing in front of his house, wiping his hands with a dirty rag, which he tossed over his shoulder when he finished. Explosives, Charlie said, enough to blow us up at least 3 times over. Doc groaned, and then joined Charlie at the Humvee's hood, resting his forearms on top of the rusted metal. You sure it was meant for us? Doc asked. I don't know. Charlie mirrored Doc's body language. Dixon doesn't think so, but none of it feels right. He frowned. Whatever intelligence that they think they're intercepting in Seattle might be bloated, outdated, wrong, or all 3. The idea that there are enough cells still active in our region that possess the manpower to deliver such a coordinated strike doesn't make any sense. They know they're on their way out. The best thing for them to do would be to retreat, head north, get the hell out of Dodge. When I was still a vet, I had a farmer bring in one of his pigs, Doc said. He told me that the animal wouldn't eat. Barely even moved at all, just stayed in one corner of the pen while the other pigs moseyed around like normal. So I examined the pig, put it through standard physical procedures. By the time I was finished, I was just as stumped as the farmer. I did blood tests. I pulled tissue samples. I checked for parasitic organisms and every disease in the book. But they all came back negative. So what was wrong with the pig? Charlie asked. Nothing, Doc answered. From a clinical and scientific standpoint, there was nothing wrong with the animal. A few weeks later, I called the farmer and asked about the animal's health. And the farmer told me the pig had died, so still curious and wondering if I missed something, I asked if I could collect the remains for an autopsy. The farmer gave me permission. Doc leaned forward. I checked every square inch of that pig's innards. Still found nothing. But Doc held up a finger. Made me realize for the first time in my veterinary career that some things couldn't be explained with reason and science. And from someone who used them every day, it scared the shit out of me. Either that or you just couldn't identify what killed it, Charlie said. Could have been something you've never seen before, something you hadn't encountered. Possibly. Doc pushed himself off the Humvee. I suppose the same could be said for your predicament. Charlie lingered by the Humvee long after Doc had walked back into the house. Maybe he was misidentifying the situation. Maybe the reason he couldn't find the answer was because he didn't know the problem. Isn't that what the terrorists had done with the EMP? The weapon had existed, sure, but Charlie had never heard of it. Neither had half the country. On the walk back toward the RV, Charlie made pit stops at the security posts, making sure that those on duty kept a heightened sense of awareness. He also made sure that they passed along the message during the shift changes. He returned to an empty trailer, Liz still out in the fields somewhere and Adeline with the daycare run by Sarah Bigelow. Naked, Charlie stepped into the tiny shower, which drew water from a rain collector on the roof. It was nothing more than an upgraded garbage can, but it provided Liz and Charlie with the small comfort of having their own shower. It was cold and smelled, but soap helped take care of that. A few others had their trailers and mobile homes rigged up with similar setups, and those that didn't bathed down in the river. When they first started that trend, they'd made up schedules for men and women to go down separately. But after a while, the village got so big that people went down when they pleased. Charlie had noticed that modesty was the first thing to fly out the window when times got tough. The cold water drizzled from the faucet, and Charlie rinsed himself of the day. Once finished, he lingered in the shower, letting himself air dry. It was a nice reprieve from the summer heat. And once he was close to dry, he stepped out of the shower and lay on the bed. The sheets still smelled like Liz. After a minute, he stood up and put on a pair of shorts just before the door opened and Liz stepped inside. "Hey," she said. Charlie waited for Adeline to enter. "Where's the little monster?" "Sarah volunteered to watch her for the night." Charlie smiled and dropped his shorts. Liz laughed. "Looks like you're ready for me." She peeled off her clothes on her walk toward him. The tan lines from her shirt darkened from her day in the sun. "You want me to shower?" Charlie reached up and grabbed her, spinning her around and flinging her on the bed, as he maneuvered on top of her, then kissed her neck. "I'll take that as a no." They made love, and when they finished, Charlie joined Liz in the shower. Both returned to the bed still naked, drying off on the sheets. The pair lay side by side, facing one another. They were quiet for a while, content with only staring at one another before Liz finally broke the silence. "What happened?" Liz asked. Charlie reached for her hands and kissed her fingers, then gently massaged her palm with his thumb. "We found some plans at the house we raided, and explosives. A lot of them. Dixon said they have intel about an attack, but they don't know when or where." Liz furrowed her brow, the light sunburn on her face causing the lines to crease white. "Do they think it'll happen at the power plant?" She paused. "Or here?" "I don't think it's for here, but the plans didn't exactly match up with the power plant either." "What do you think?" Charlie hesitated, lingering on the question before finally giving his answer. "I think it's something new. I think they're using the last of their energy to hit us with something that we wouldn't expect, like they did with the EMP." "Well, that's a starting point, right?" Liz asked, trying to remain optimistic. Charlie nodded, wanting to break from the subject so he could give his brain time to rest. "How are the fields going?" Liz smiled. "Good. Really good. Mario says that we'll have crops for the fall." It was the best news he'd heard all day. That'll take pressure off of us for any increases in demand we have heading into next year. He collapsed onto his back. Thank God. Liz crawled over and straddled his waist as she climbed on top of him and gave him a kiss on the nose. "Everything's gonna be fine." "I know," Charlie said. Liz raised her eyebrows. "Do you?" She smirked. "Because right now you don't look like a man who believes that." Charlie ran his fingertips down Liz's sides, keeping quiet. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Liz asked. "Yeah." Charlie spoke the words in a sigh. The raid had provided Charlie the needed distraction from having to think about tomorrow's ceremony. He'd been dreading it since his mother brought it up 3 months ago. Martha Decker wanted a ceremony for her dead husband, Harold Decker, and she wanted the entire orchard to come and pay homage. She told Charlie that if it weren't for his father, that none of what they had here would even be possible. Wouldn't have been so bad if his mother hadn't requested he give a speech. "Do you want me to go over it with you again?" Liz asked. "No," Charlie frowned, shaking his head. He'd already gone over it 100 times, and reading the 2 pages he scribbled down was hardly going to make him feel better. Liz pulled Charlie's face toward him. "Hey, you're going to do fine." "Thanks." But as Liz rested her head on Charlie's chest, he couldn't force himself to believe it. And as he drifted off to sleep, the nightmares returned. Charlie was thrust back into the woods, running through the charred and smoking remains of the orchard the morning after the fire. But this time, when he made it out to the road and headed for Mayfield, there was no assistance from Dixon in getting a ride into town. He ran the entire trip, his feet pounding against the pavement. But no matter how fast he ran or how far, the road stretched to an endless horizon. His subconsciousness pushed his body past the point of fatigue, past the point of failure, but still his legs moved forward. Muscles aching and his lungs burning, Charlie finally saw the sign for the town, and above Mayfield were dark storm clouds. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled. Charlie ran past the burnt wreckage of the town. Bodies lay in the street, disfigured and burned. The hospital building towered up ahead. But there were no soldiers, no terrorists that surrounded the power plant as Charlie neared the ER's entrance on the first floor. "Dad!" His voice had reverted to when he was a little kid. The same fear and uncertainty that plagued him as a child returned to him in the nightmare. Charlie stepped over slain bodies, tripping over legs and arms on his path toward the stairs. He screamed for his father the entire journey up, and the closer he moved toward the top floor, the worse that anxiety became. But while he strived toward his father, unsure of what he would find, his body and muscles slowed the way they did in dreams sometimes. No matter how fast he tried to move, or how much effort he exerted, he couldn't move faster than slow motion. Finally, after the grueling snail's pace, Charlie reached the top floor. He immediately spied the door where he remembered finding his father. Charlie paused in the doorway, and he saw Harold Decker on his back, blood still pouring out of his stomach from the gunshot wound that killed him. He lay twisted and mangled, motionless. Charlie stepped toward him, and the tears began to fall. He crouched by his father's side, examining the fatal wound that killed him, and then picked up his father's hand. It was still warm to the touch, and as Charlie sobbed, he struggled to speak. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Charlie said. "Should have been here with you, should have listened to what you were trying to do, because you were right. You can't sit back and expect things to be taken care of for you. You have to do them yourself or they won't get done at all." Harold remained motionless, and then, slowly, he turned his head to face Charlie. "You should have been here," Harold said. Charlie squeezed his father's hand. "I'm sorry, You were always weak. I tried to make you stronger, Charlie. I did. But I failed. You're still weak. You'll always be weak." Harold pulled his hand away from Charlie's grip. He stared at his son, but while he spoke and moved, there was no life in his eyes. "Dad?" Charlie gently shook his father. "Dad!" Harold remained unresponsive and motionless. He no longer looked at Charlie, his eyes staring off into some empty space in the corner of the room. "I'm sorry," Charlie sobbed, his cries intensifying. He clutched his father's arm, squeezing tight, wanting another chance to right the wrongs, to make everything the way it was before. "Dad!" But his nightmare wouldn't afford him such luxuries, and he was forced to mourn his dead father again.